Early in the course, we learned about how corrupt some of the popes were. But surely that could not have continued, else the Counter-Reformation might have been utterly doomed. Did the popes begin to act with more integrity? When did that begin to change?
It took a while, Paul, but finally some popes were elected who had a better understanding of Reformation issues and who actually did attempt to kind of live up to the standards of their high office within the Catholic Church. Now, you're perfectly correct in remembering that the popes in the first part of the Reformation were not particularly effective church leaders. We think of, for example, Leo X, who was the pope at the time of Martin Luther. Now, he was a great Renaissance patron of the arts. He had very refined taste and manners. He's supposed to have said when he was elected to the papacy, well, God has given us the papacy, so now let's enjoy it. And certainly he did. But Leo X was not at all prepared theologically, doctrinally, for the Reformation. He was not the kind of man who would have understood the concerns that Luther was raising about himself personally and about the way the Christian religion was being taught and practiced. When Leo passed away in 1521, he was succeeded by Adrian VI, who was from the Netherlands, who obtained the papacy largely through the influence of the Habsburgs. And perhaps Adrian VI might have made some changes. He was something of a humanist, or at least a friend of Erasmus. But the Italians, the papal bureaucracy, the Curia, didn't respect Adrian. They thought that he spoke bad Latin, that he was kind of boorish, unmannered. He didn't understand the way things went within the papacy, the way things were supposed to be done in Rome. And so they mocked him more than they obeyed him. Had he lived longer, perhaps he would have made a difference, but he didn't. After just about a year as being pope, he passed away. And then the cardinals went back to not only the same kind, but the same family from which Leo X had come. They elected Leo X's cousin, another Medici pope from that important Florentine banking and commercial family. This was Clement VII. Now, he was pope at the time that the papacy lost England. While he was pope, Protestantism made great advances. Clement tried hard. He was, like his cousin, he was refined, mannered, a patron of the arts. He also tried to use political measures to deal with the challenges being raised by the Reformation, but was unsuccessful. Of course, one other problem that he had to deal with was the fact that the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor were waging war in Italy during his papacy. And at one particular point, Clement VII decided to side with France as against the emperor. Turned out to be a bad choice. The French lost, and the imperial troops advanced upon the city of Rome. In fact, they not only advanced against the city, they actually took the city. This was in 1527, and that initiated an episode in the history of the papacy known as the sack of Rome, the sack of Rome. For several months, these soldiers really kind of went on a rampage within the city. They occupied the city. They terrorized its citizens. They exploited its wealth. In the wake of their coming, there was terrible famine and disease, so the population was decimated. And all during this time, the Pope, Clement VII, was basically a prisoner. He was holed up in his castle fortress in the city of Rome and couldn't get out and couldn't exercise authority. It was really one of the low points in the story of the papacy, and Clement VII was the one who experienced it. So Clement was not an effective counter-Reformation pope. So up until the mid-1530s then, we have really a lack of good leadership in the papacy. But in 1534, this begins to change. In that year, the cardinals elect Alessandro Farnese as pope, and he takes the name of Paul III. Now, Paul III was in many respects still a Renaissance pope. He had gotten his start earlier in the century as somebody who was interested in obtaining wealth for himself and for his family. In fact, he lived with a mistress. He had children by her, illegitimate children. And so he was concerned with advancing their interests in the church as he moved on up through the bureaucracy. But by the time he was elected pope in 1534, he realized that if the church was going to survive, it had to come up with a strategy for dealing with the Protestant Reformation. So we find some of the first real steps toward change in the papacy with Paul III. I'll give you an example. Right after he was elected pope, he announced that he was going to call a church council. Now, this is something that his predecessors had really shied away from because they were afraid that a church council might try to take over the church in somewhat the same way as had occurred at the beginning of the 15th century at the Council of Constance. So Paul's predecessors hadn't wanted to call a church council, but Paul III was ready to do that. And in fact, within a couple of years of his election, he actually summoned a council to the city of Mantua for 1537. Now, as it turned out, that council didn't meet, and it wasn't until 1545 that a council actually did meet. But nonetheless, Paul III proved willing to call a council so as to address the problems facing the Roman Church. Paul III also brought into the government of the Church some reform-minded men, and he appointed as cardinals people like Jacopo Sadoleto, Gasparo Contarini, Reginald Poole, the Englishman, and Gian Pietro Carafa. And these were all men who had a reputation for being concerned about the problems in the church. They weren't simply connected to important Italian families, which was the typical kind of cardinal who had been appointed. They were reformers. Moreover, Paul appointed to these men and to others the task of preparing for a church council. He made them into a papal commission to actually set an agenda for a church council, which they did. They actually issued a report in which they analyzed the problems in the church and made recommendations for correcting those problems. Now, this was a report in which there was tremendous indictment of the papacy, of the church, for its worldliness, for the corruptions that had plagued the church really now for centuries. The papacy was indicted for nepotism and simony. Bishops were charged with absenteeism, not actually going to the dioceses to serve as bishops. Pluralism was indicted, the idea that for a churchman you could collect benefices without necessarily doing the work of any of those posts. The church was indicted for dispensations. Dispensations from church law could be obtained for money. And of course, churchmen were indicted also for their sexual immorality, their failure to keep their vows of celibacy. So it was really a pretty fierce indictment of the life of the clergy, the life of the church. Not the doctrine, but simply the way they failed to measure up to their own standards, the standards of their own church. Well, this document actually came into the hands of the Protestants, including Martin Luther. And Luther thought it was such an indictment of the papacy that he actually had it published along with his own kind of notes on what it is that it demonstrated. And he believed that this document produced by these reform-minded cardinals and prelates actually proved what Luther had already concluded, and that was that the Pope was the Antichrist. Now, as far as Paul himself is concerned, there's some evidence that he tried to implement some reforms. He wasn't particularly successful, but as I indicated before, eventually a church council did meet, and as we'll see, that church council did have as part of its agenda addressing the kinds of issues that had been raised by this report of the cardinals. Now, I should mention also, with respect to Paul III, that while he was Pope, there were actually some efforts made to negotiate and perhaps even reach a compromise with the Protestants. This took place within the Holy Roman Empire in the late 1530s, early 1540s. And there's one particular episode that I'd like to mention, and it seems to be particularly interesting. And that's the Diet of Regensburg. It was held in 1541 because, coincidentally with that diet, there were negotiations between Protestant leaders, Philip Melanchthon, Martin Bucer, on the one hand, and on the other hand, Catholic theologians, Luther's old foe John Eck, and Gasparo Contarini, whom we mentioned before, one of those reform-minded cardinals that Paul had appointed. And they actually sought to address the doctrinal issues, and really quite surprisingly, the one issue upon which they made some progress was the issue of justification. And basically what these theologians came up with was really the idea that the term justification could be used broadly to include both the imputed righteousness that we receive through faith on account of Christ, the kind of righteousness that's so important to the Protestant position, but also could be used for inherent righteousness. This idea that the righteousness that we receive from God resides in us, and we kind of work it out over the course of our lives as Christians so that we actually become righteous as well as being declared righteous. Well, this document really doesn't go very far. In point of fact, the negotiators reached an impasse upon other doctrines like the role of the papacy in the church and the invocation of saints, the doctrine of the Mass. And then when they took their compromise on justification back to their constituencies, they weren't interested in it either. I mean, Luther repudiated what Melanchthon had negotiated, and when Contarini got back to Italy, he was actually charged with being a heretic. So I don't want to make a whole lot out of the Diet of Regensburg in those negotiations, but it does show that at least under Paul III, there was some effort to address the doctrinal concerns being raised by the Protestants. Paul III also was a strong supporter of the new religious orders that would breathe kind of new life, vigor, enthusiasm, and dedication into the religious life He promoted new orders like the Ursulines, the Barnabites, and it was actually Paul III who approved of the Society of Jesus, that is the Jesuits. So in all of these respects, we can think of Paul III as a different kind of pope, somebody who was committed to addressing the problems of the church, not just those raised by Protestantism, but even longstanding abuses in the church. However, the final judgment on Paul III definitely has to be a mixed one, because Paul III was himself guilty of what we call nepotism, that is, promoting his family interests within the church, within the papacy. And in fact, for his own family, he tried to carve out of the papal states some territories, domains, and titles for the Farnese family, so that Paul III was himself clearly a nepotist, somebody who still was entangled with this long-standing practice of exploiting the church rather than simply serving the church. If we want to find a pope whom we might designate as the first of the Counter-Reformation popes, that is, somebody who, as was typical of popes in much of the modern era, somebody who was confident in his Catholicism, somebody who didn't want to make compromises with the Protestants because he thought they were heretics and that Protestantism was leading people to hell, and a pope who was strongly committed to enforcing the rules of the church. I think the man that we would designate as the first of that kind of pope was Paul IV. Now, Paul IV was elected to the papacy in 1555, in spite of the fact that he was an old man. He served for 4 years, 1555 to 1559. Now, he was one of those who had been named a cardinal by Paul III. This was Gian Pietro Carafa. And he took, as his papal name, Paul, really in kind of honor of Paul III, whom he had previously served. But now Paul IV was a man who really had a lot of stubborn self-confidence, not only in himself, but in his office and in his church. He was fully committed to the idea that the Church of the Pope, the Church of Rome, was the church that Christ had established on earth. So he didn't want to have anything to do with Protestantism or making compromises with Protestants. In fact, he didn't want to have anything to do with a church council. As we'll see, by the time of Paul IV, the Council of Trent had already met and addressed a goodly number of issues, but its work wasn't done yet. But Paul IV didn't call it back into session. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. Instead, Paul IV's preferred instrument for dealing with doctrinal deviation, for dealing with heresy, for dealing with Protestantism was the Inquisition, the Papal Inquisition. Paul III had revived this special ecclesiastical tribunal in the 1540s, and he had placed Carafa in charge of it. And even as Pope, Paul IV continued to attend the sessions of the Inquisition. In the history books, Protestant historians particularly have pointed to the Inquisition as a peculiar institution that kind of demonstrates the cruelty of the early modern papacy as it went after the heretics. Well, there's a degree of truth to that, but clearly everywhere in Christendom, not just in Rome and not just through the Inquisition, there were attacks upon religious dissenters. In Protestant countries, as we saw with respect to England, you could get into trouble if you were a Catholic. And so in Catholic countries, you could get into trouble if you were a Protestant. But it is true that the Inquisition was a particularly efficient way of dealing with heretics in this early modern period. Even before the Reformation had begun, the Inquisition had been used with success in Spain. Earlier in the century, Emperor Charles V had used it in the Netherlands. But now, under Paul III and especially Paul IV, it was going to be used in Italy, the Papal States especially, but other parts of Italy as well. Now, what the Inquisition was a special ecclesiastical tribunal that could summon people before it on charges of heresy. It did use some techniques that we in modern times would think were unfair and wrong. For example, torture to elicit evidence, to elicit confessions. Also, there was no inherent right for those accused to face and to cross-examine their accusers. So, from a modern perspective, this is not the kind of judicial system we would like. I think from the perspective of the 16th century, it was not particularly unique except in its efficiency. It did what it was supposed to. In the 16th century, there were maybe 100 people or so who were executed as a result of being found guilty for heresy by the Papal Inquisition in Italy. But of course, execution wasn't the only punishment. You could lose your property, you could lose your liberty, or you could lose your life. And as I said, Paul IV liked using the Inquisition. In general, Paul IV was very, very strict, and he was concerned that the clergy live up to the standards that they were supposed to, according to the rules of the church. So, for example, monks who lived outside of their monasteries without permission got into big trouble with Paul IV. And he would order such monks to be beaten, to be scourged, or maybe even sent off to the galleys. Priests who broke the laws could lose all of their property and their possessions as a result of Paul IV's mandates and cracking down on this lack of discipline within the church. Paul IV wasn't particularly liked by the clergy of Rome. He accomplished a lot of things by intimidation. He is supposed to have had a volcanic temper, so he'd blow up at people. So I don't know that anybody thought of him as a model pope. Nonetheless, from the perspective of the century, clearly Paul IV was a new kind of pope. And this was a man who was dedicated to his task, to his church, to the rules and the discipline of the church. And as such, as that kind of pope, he really sets the tone for a number of popes who will follow him and provide this new kind of leadership in the Counter-Reformation.